Hi everybody, I'm going to tell you a story from my childhood. When I was a little girl, I used to live in a house in the middle of the countryside. And it was a big rectangular house that had a great big kitchen window that faced our long driveway, our big front yard, and red tulips that you could just barely see from the kitchen table. It was in this house that we had Zeus and Hera, our two wonderful and mischievous dogs. Every morning, my mother would let them outside, and they would go off on their own little adventures. And every evening, I would sit at our kitchen table, and I would look out up our long driveway, and past our great big front yard, and past the tulips that were just barely visible from the kitchen window. And they would be coming back, as happy as can be. Now, Zeus and Hera were the best of dogs. Zeus had the softest fur, like this guy here. And Hera had the cuddliest personality. And after their day of adventures, they would curl up with my brothers and sister and I in the living room and lay there until it was time to go to bed. They were always tired whenever they came back, and I never understood why. One evening, after Zeus and Hera returned from their adventures, my mama got a call from our neighbor, Mrs. Newhouse. "Did you see it?" Mrs. Newhouse said loudly through the phone, so loudly that I could hear it. "See what?" my mother asked. "The bear!" Mrs. Newhouse exclaimed. My mother was confused. What bear? And so Mrs. Newhouse said, "There was a bear walking around in my field of wheat." Now Mrs. Newhouse had a field of wheat that was as gold as a mine. My mother was of course very worried at this point, and thought about not letting the dogs out to play in the morning. "Oh, but," she said, "I'm sure that it's nothing to worry about." And so, the next morning, the dogs went out onto their adventures, and when evening came, I sat by the kitchen window, past our long driveway, our big front yard, and the tulips that you could just barely see from the kitchen table, and the dogs would be coming back, happy as can be. While we were all in the living room that evening, because Zeus had the softest hair and Hera had the cuddliest personality, Mama got another phone call from Mrs. House. "Did you see it?" Mrs. Newhouse said. "See what?" my mom asked. "The bear!" Mrs. Newhouse exclaimed. "What bear?" my mom said, of course a little irritated at this point. "I saw a huge black bear next to my husband's truck. It was following very close behind your yellow dog, Mrs. Newhouse's husband. He had this old truck that was as blue as a robin's egg." My mother was very worried at this point. She thought to herself, "Oh, this bear, it's following around my dog." She thought about not letting the dogs out in the morning to play, but then she said, "I'm really sure it's nothing to worry about." So the next morning, the dogs went on their adventures as normal. And in the evening, as always, I watched from the window that faced our long driveway and our big front yard and the red tulips that you could just barely see from the kitchen table. And of course, our dogs would be walking back as happy as can be. So, while we were all in the living room that night, because Zeus's fur was the fluffiest and Hera had the cuddliest personality, Mrs. Newhouse called the family again. "Did you see it?" she said. "See what?" my mother asked. "The bear!" Mrs. Newhouse was very convinced. "What bear?" my mother said, trying not to be too frustrated. "I saw a monstrous black bear by your mailbox today, and it was very close to your yellow dog." My mother was at this point very worried and thought about not letting the dogs outside in the morning to play. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," she said. Then the morning came the next day, but this time, because it was Saturday, I went out to play with Zeus and Hera for the day. We journeyed up our long, long driveway, played in our big front yard, smelled the tulips that you could just barely see from the kitchen table, and when evening came, we went back. But this time, Mrs. Newhouse called again. When my mother answered the phone, I told Mama we were playing outside all day and never once did I see a bear. Mama thought hard for a moment, and then she answered the phone with a hello. "Did you see it?" Mrs. Newhouse was frantic at this point. "See what?" "The bear!" Mrs. Newhouse was absolutely convinced. "What bear?" my mother said. Her tone was a little bit different than when we had heard it the last few evenings. "I saw a gargantuan black bear in my wheat field today, by my husband's truck, and by your mailbox, following your yellow dog and your daughter around the whole time." My mama was very quiet. She looked at me with the dogs, and she laughed harder than I had ever heard her laugh. "Mrs. Newhouse, it was never a bear that you saw. That was only our dog Zeus. He is a Newfoundland. A big, fluffy, black dog who never tires of adventures." Mrs. Newhouse never did call us again, and the dogs went out to play every morning, as they always did. I went to go and play with them as well whenever I got the chance. Otherwise, every evening, I watched from the window that faced our very, very long driveway, our big front yard, and the red tulips that you could just barely see from the kitchen table. And of course, the dogs would always be walking back, happy as can be.